Okay, so it's about 2 past the hour. We're going to get started in just a moment here. And I'm very happy to be here talking about one of my favorite topics today, which is sociolinguistic language documentation. So we've talked a little bit about how to look at the sounds and the grammar and the structure of your language as you're documenting it, but this is a chance to look at some parts of sort of the social world that your language lives in, right? Language is fundamentally a social practice. It's something we do to interact with each other. And so we're going to dive a little deeper into documenting some of the nuances of how language serves as a social interaction. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen. Let's hope everyone can see this all right. I think I see some nods. Great, glad it's showing up. So let's start just an acknowledgement that we are 3/4 of the way through this fall's webinar series already. I can't believe it. Just a reminder, next week we're going to be learning some technical skills, including the software Elan and video subtitling, which a lot of you are interested in. And then at the end, we're actually going to provide an opportunity for some of you to present about your language documentation work. So after week 8, we'll have sort of a bonus week 9, where some of you folks can take the stage and tell us a little bit about your language contexts, your language work, and your communities. So more details about that to come in the post-workshop email. So let's get started just with this question of what is sociolinguistics, right? We're titling this week Sociolinguistic Documentation, big technical word. So what exactly is this? Well, obviously, you can kind of get the clue. Socio, it's something social. And the very preeminent sociolinguist Walt Wolfram provides this definition through the Linguistic Society of America. He says, language use symbolically represents fundamental dimensions of social behavior and human interaction. The notion is simple, but the ways in which language reflects behavior can often be complex and subtle. Okay, that was not exactly a simple definition. That was a bit densely academic. So let's see if we can get it even more simplified. Essentially, sociolinguistics is the study of how language use, right, the way people talk or sign, the way this kind of represents and also interacts with and affects and changes social structures, the social world all of us occupy. And if we want to really kind of bring it even simpler, how we talk or sign is a result of who we are and how we fit into society. And in some ways, the ways we fit into society can also be shaped by how we talk. So it's this mutually reinforcing relationship. And so this is, let me just say, a gigantic subfield of linguistics. You can do an entire PhD just in small topics within sociolinguistics. We could spend years and years talking about this, but today we're just going to sort of check in on how this could form part of our language documentation work. And I've linked some of the introductory textbooks in sociolinguistics here on the slides if you're interested in diving into this incredibly interesting topic. But if we remember back to session 1, this definition of language documentation was entailed creating a lasting multi-purpose record of a language, right? This is sort of the standard definition we're often given of language documentation. But let's update it a little bit. Let's move beyond just creating a record of a language. And much like the original author of this definition of language documentation did, let's expand it a bit to talk about creating a record of the linguistic practices characteristic of a given speech community, right? This takes a little bit of unpacking as to how this is meaningfully different. But the first one is just talking about documenting one language, assuming that we can put neat boundaries on where that language begins and ends and some other language begins and ends. And it really starts to acknowledge that many speech communities are multilingual, that people use different varieties of different languages in their daily lives, and that what they do with all of these language capacities they have can tell you a lot more than just looking at the structure of one language. And so we're going to look not only at the grammar and sounds of a named language that we identify as a specific language, we also want to look at how people live their lives with all of the language knowledge they have. And if we want to get really, really ambitious, we might even start trying to understand why people use language in the way they do. And that takes a lot of thought, a lot of work, a lot of analysis, but we can start asking these questions with the tools of sociolinguistic documentation. And so one of the things that I want to highlight here, especially as pointed out by my late mentor, Dr. Tucker Childs, in this really important paper called Beyond the Ancestral Code Towards Sociolinguistically Informed Language Documentation, he and his colleagues talk about how linguistic ecologies, right, these interactions between languages and communities and people, these ecologies are actually more fragile than what we might call languages. That means that even if a specific language is not highly endangered, the ecology that it lives in, this interplay of languages and social roles, those can be very endangered. And in most parts of the world, those things are what tend to fall apart first in times of language stress and language shift. And so one thing from the perspective of documentary linguistics, if the goal is making records of what people do with language, documenting these language ecologies is really urgent, right? Documenting the ways people use multiple languages and interact with them is sort of a high urgency task, even compared to documenting specific languages. And this is one of the points that we see increasingly within documentary linguistics, is that this idea of just documenting one language all by itself, kind of in isolation, has a lot to do with very narrow Western academic language ideologies, but doesn't really mean much in most language communities in most parts of the world, right? Where I work in Cameroon and where Tucker worked in Sierra Leone, if you ask someone what their mother tongue is, they might be like, well, like which one? I grew up speaking 3 languages and then I learned 5 more. And so just documenting one language on its own might not be super meaningful in a lot of contexts, or at least there's more to it, right? And so that said, I just want to reiterate, this is a really big topic. We could spend years talking about it. So we're just going to do a tiny little sample of some ideas in language, sociolinguistic language documentation today. But here are 3 things that we could look at, right? So the first one is multilingualism. What languages do people know? What languages do people use in their daily lives, and why? We could also look at variation, which is a broad term for any kind of differences in how people speak, right? Whether it's young versus old people, or men versus women, or people in this town versus that town, or people who, I don't know, really root for this football team versus this football team. There are all kinds of social divisions that show up in how we talk. And then we're also going to talk a little bit about language attitudes and ideologies, right? These beliefs, whether they're conscious or unconscious, that shape how people use language, how they feel about language, what they believe about language. And so these are 3 things we're going to look at a little bit today. So multilingualism, probably a familiar idea to most of you. I think if I'm looking at the participant list, I'm guessing that most people in here are multilingual, because I don't know if English is anyone's first language here, or even if it is, I bet you probably know bits and pieces of other languages at least. And so you know that different languages can serve quite different purposes in your life. And this is one of the things you might look at when it comes to sociolinguistic documentation, right? So not only what languages are present in a specific place or a community or a group of people, but also how do people learn these languages? How do they use them? And questions like, let's say two people who consider themselves to have different mother tongues meet on the street or have to do a transaction in a store. What languages are they going to use together? One of the classic sociolinguistic questions is often phrased as, who speaks what to whom when, right? What roles do these languages play? Not only social roles or pragmatic roles, but also what emotional or psychological meaning might different languages have for different people in a given community. And again, this is going to vary a lot, but person to person, these are very individual, unique questions for each person. And so, for example, in my dissertation research, I really wanted to learn about the linguistic ecology of a specific town, right? If you're doing a dissertation, you have limited time to get the thing done. And so it helps to focus your question on something pretty specific. And for me, that was the town where I was living, a town called Campo. And my overall goal with that dissertation was to understand a little bit better what was happening with the endangerment of a specific language spoken in that town. And so I wanted to know a little bit more about what other languages were present in this ecology, who spoke them, why people spoke them for different purposes. And in the sociolinguistic literature, these sort of situations and parts of life where you use different languages are called domains of use. So I wanted to know what domains of use each language in Campo occupied. And if you're a sociolinguist, you may be saying right now, hey, the domains of use theory has been shown to be inadequate to account for, and that's fine. We're just going to start slow. Domains of use are a pretty useful concept. Oh, and we have a great comment in the chat I see about linguistic ecology. So I will come back to any chat comments or questions at the end here. All right. And so, obviously there are many languages in Campo that I found, and it would take a long time to talk about the roles all of them play, but I'd like all of you to maybe reflect on your own communities for a second. What kind of multilingualism do you see there? Which languages perhaps do you specifically know and use? And then beyond the ones you know, what languages do your neighbors and your friends and your family members and the person that runs the store down the street, what languages do they know and use? And if you dive a little bit deeper, you might start thinking about what roles these languages play in your social world. Do people have beliefs about the purpose of each of those languages? What do they actually use them for, right? So maybe in some places, Arabic might be considered the language of education and formal knowledge, but maybe somebody's mother tongue is the language of warmth and fun and family and social closeness. And you might even start asking about where you can or cannot use specific languages, whether practically or maybe because it's not considered polite or appropriate or whatever, right? Can you shop at the store in that language? Can you go talk to a government official in that language? Start identifying those domains of use for each language in your own life. And then if we move beyond multilingualism, which I guess you could conceive of as, the presence of different whole languages in a place, we then get into the more specific notion of how things within a specific language might be different from person to person. So, the smarty pants definition is, how do different people talk different? And these differences in how people talk, again, a really fundamental question in sociolinguistics, shape how other people see them, right? If you think about different accents in your own language, for example, you might find you have really strong psychological or emotional reactions to some of those accents. You might have opinions about people who talk that way, right? So if you're an American, this might land for you. Compare what you'd think of somebody who said, I'm fixing to wash my car over yonder in the holler, versus, I am preparing to go wash my car over there in the valley, right? You probably have an immediate, strong social perception of the difference in those varieties of English. And so the first one, I guess, would be my heritage variety of English, which would be Appalachian English. And then the second one would be formal, what they might call newscaster American English, right? The high prestige, standard, fancy pants version. And so you probably have varieties of your language that maybe have more prestige or less, or that are associated with a particular place? And we'll talk about both of those. I see questions in the chat and some comments. Great. Hi, folks who are just joining us. And so for maybe anyone familiar with American varieties, what are the social perceptions you might have of the people who say each of these things, right? I described the second one as the prestige variety, or the quote unquote standard. And the first one, at least from my experience, doesn't just tell you that somebody is from this Appalachian region. It also carries a lot of social meaning, right? Oh, I see some comments that the second one sounds a little stiff. Yeah, I can see that. This prestige variants often also sound kind of stuck up to some people. And then it goes the other way as well. The first Appalachian variant might be considered, like less educated. Both my parents had experiences of people thinking if they spoke naturally that they sounded less educated than someone who spoke the second way. Or more poor or whatever. There's a lot of stigma on some varieties of English. And so you might find similar variations in what people think of people who speak a certain way in your languages. And those are endlessly fascinating to explore. So I would love to hear from some of you in the chat if you can think of some of these social perceptions that language carries in your context. And again, another American English example, because that's my mother tongue. There are these three sentences here that all mean literally the exact same thing, right? Go get me these sugary, fizzy drinks. So would you grab me a pop? Would you grab me a soda? And would you grab me a Coke? So we got one word that's different here, and they all mean physically the same thing, but do y'all know why somebody would say one of these versus the others? Does any of this land as telling you something about the speakers? Yeah. Oh, I see that in New Zealand and Australia, they'd say, grab me a fizzy. I have not heard that one. Interesting. But yeah, I see two different comments here, actually, interestingly. Pop is New England and pop is Midwest. And in Kentucky, we say pop, right? So these are regional differences in what people call this sugary, fizzy beverage. And this is one of those classic American English differences that you'll see in sociolinguistic textbooks. There's a nice atlas paper here that actually shows all the different places in America where they documented people saying pop versus soda versus Coke. And this may have changed because this came out a while ago, but if you look at this map, you'll see this big green area is supposedly where people say pop for Coke. So it's kind of the northern half of the country. And then down in the southern half, people allegedly mostly say Coke, right? That is a specific type of beverage or a brand of beverage, but it's used as a generic name for any kind of sugary, fizzy beverage down south. And then sort of on the coasts, roughly, people allegedly say soda. And I grew up in Washington, D.C., so soda sounds natural to me because I'm from this blue zone. But if people say pop or Coke, I know what they mean, but I'm like, oh, you must be a northerner or you must be a southerner, right? Again, this may have changed. I see a soder is indeed the correct spelling. That's funny. And interestingly, in Quebec, you say Coke, huh? So this map doesn't really cover Canada, so I'd be curious to see the Canadian version. But you'll also notice that within each of these broad areas, you see variation in the dots. So that doesn't mean everyone in this part of the country says Coke. You see people saying other stuff. You see some soda sayers, you see some pop sayers down south. Same thing in the pop zone, you also see people saying soda or Coke or whatever else. So this is a good reminder that there is no clear boundary in most regional variation. It's always just patterns rather than hard lines. All right. And so if we look at not only the words people use in different areas, you can also look at pronunciation differences, right? So even if you're using the exact same word, you might pronounce it a little differently. Like I live in Oregon now, some people say pop, but they don't say pap. like I used to hear in Michigan. Same word, different vowel. And that can also give you more extra clues about where somebody might be from or live. But you can also look at differences in the grammar of a specific language or variety across social groups or maybe across geography. So every part of how we talk can experience variation, right? And some of the really common ways that things may vary could be by age, right? Older people say it this way, younger people tend to say it this way. It could be by gender, right? Like if you say it this way, you might sound really feminine versus saying it this way sounds really masculine. It could be about where you're from or where you grew up. It could even be about more individual characteristics, like maybe you express political beliefs by pronouncing a word this way versus this way. Or, if you are Christian versus Muslim, you might have a different pronunciation of a specific word that indexes what faith group you belong to. Same thing with like socioeconomic class, right? Maybe this variety sounds rich and this variety sounds poor. And basically, any social identity can carry this type of variation with it. So there are some really classic studies in sociolinguistics based at an American high school, a secondary school, and it looked at kids who were the same age and were from basically the same sort of socioeconomic background, right? They were all about as middle class as each other, but they had differences in how they talked based on which group of friends they belonged to or wanted to be part of, right? And so a really famous one was the jocks and burnouts study, which showed that there was a social category at this secondary school called jocks. And this was the kids who really were involved in school activities. Maybe they played sports, they did their homework on time. They were very good kids who followed the rules. And then there were the burnouts who, they maybe didn't go to class all the time and they thought it was stupid to participate in school activities. And they mostly wanted to hang out in the city and be cool. And they pronounced things differently than the jocks. So they established this social identity, even in this tiny world of one secondary school. They used differences in speech to establish their social identities just based on individual preference. So you'll find this everywhere. People really tell you who they are or who they want to be by how they talk. So this also ties nicely into attitudes and ideologies about language. And so these, again, are people's beliefs and feelings and thoughts about what language is, which languages carry what values or are appropriate to use in what situations, what you think of people who talk a certain way, right? All these sort of high level governing principles that tell you what social meanings language has. And again, these can be conscious, these can be things that you could articulate if you were asked about them. And they may be unconscious, right? Things that you never explicitly think about, but that are always kind of running in the back of your mind that shape how you talk. And a really great example of language ideologies from my time at the University of Buea in Cameroon. This is a sign that just says you can't speak Pidgin on this university campus, basically. And Pidgin is sort of a really widely used lingua franca. It's a different language than English. It's a mixture of English with a lot of local languages. And pretty much everyone speaks it. Everyone speaks it. It indicates warmth and friendship and solidarity and just sort of like regular community life. But the university is very strict that you are not supposed to use Pidgin in a university setting. And there are signs like this all over the campus. One of them is like, be my friend, speak English, and Pidgin is a degenerate language. It will ruin your English, and things like that. So sometimes you'll see signs like this in a lot of places, whether it's, here we only speak French, or please speak standard Arabic here, or whatever. You'll see these very overt language ideologies in play. But more often they're more subtle. They show up in people commenting to each other on the street if they hear a certain language, or if you look at online comments on a Facebook post about a language and you see people being like, oh, that sounds silly, right? You'll see these in varying levels of officialness versus informal places. And some common language ideologies that you might want to look at in your community could be things like, do people see being multilingual as a strength or as a weakness, right? Do some people consider certain languages prettier or better or more logical or whatever? One question that always really interests me is, who should speak a language? Who is allowed to speak a language? And who is considered a good speaker or a real speaker of that language? And this comes up a lot in language revitalization contexts. This question of who counts as a fluent speaker? Who are we allowed to learn from, right? Who do we lift up as a real speaker of our language? And then we also get into sort of more high level questions about what language is and how it works, right? So, in a lot of contexts, language might be considered a living thing, either in a spiritual sense or maybe in the biological metaphor that linguists use, right? This language is dying, or this language is strong, or whatever. And also, this question of who is allowed to use a language. There was an interesting paper that recently came out about the appropriation of Indigenous languages in Canada by non-Indigenous people, and them being used in sort of inappropriate ways to claim a false Indigenous identity. And so these questions of who gets to claim or own or use a language are really important in a lot of contexts. And then this question of how language interacts with identity can be very important too. So I heard this a lot in IASA country, being a real IASA person requires you to speak IASA, right? If you don't speak IASA, then your identity as an IASA person might be in question. And so now that we've covered these broad questions, we might want to look at some concrete examples of how to document this stuff. So documenting multilingualism is really fun. It's also not very well theorized within the field of sociolinguistic documentation, right? We are just starting to develop really good tools and methodologies for documenting this. And I will put some useful papers in the Google Drive folder, a lot of cool work coming from different parts of the world, especially West Africa, on this topic. But a good first step in looking at multilingualism, just like looking at any sociolinguistic question, is observing. Just look around, listen, spend some time in public places. So whatever the big public place is in your community, is it, the bus station? Is it a certain bar? Is it the Walmart? I think there was a cool paper on Indigenous language use in Walmarts recently, because it serves as a really important social gathering space. So just spend some time in a public spot and listen. What languages do you hear or see in use? Do people stay in the same language the whole time they're in that public space? Who is using which languages, and is it as clear as you would expect it to be? And do you see certain languages being used for specific things, right? Do people tend to get informal and tell jokes and be friendly in a certain language, but sort of exert their authority in another language? Or can you see any patterns like that? And this is a good phase at which you maybe take some notes for yourself, bring a little notebook, write down your observations, say something like, oh man, I just heard someone switch to X language when they wanted to sound serious. But when you're listening in public, do be cautious about recording. In many contexts, it's not really polite or even ethical to record strangers in public without them knowing. So I would urge caution on that. Talk to folks in your community about whether that is okay. Surveys are another pretty good first step for looking at multilingualism. So this is basically just when you ask a standardized set of questions to a bunch of people, right? It could be 3 questions, it could be a longer survey, and it could be written or it could be spoken. You could just go up to people and be like, can I ask you 3 questions, right? What languages do you speak? Where did you learn them? And what do you think about them? Or you could do it in a written form and mail out surveys or have them available in an event, whatever is easiest and most comfortable for folks in your context. But surveys, just a note of caution, surveys work best if you already have a little bit of a sense of what's happening in a given place or a given community. Because when you are designing a survey, you're already baking in some of your own assumptions and knowledge about what questions are important to ask and what you want to find out. So surveys are really useful if you already have developed a specific question or a specific goal of things you want to understand. But it can also be a good starting point. And let's say you want to document variation within a specific language or whatever we want to call a language. So this again is how people talk differently. Maybe they use different words, maybe they pronounce things a bit differently. This is a really fun and interesting topic, I think. I love it. And there's a lot of neat work starting to happen now, looking at variation in languages other than the big global languages, right? There's been tons of research about variation in English or Spanish or French or Mandarin, but not that much about variation within indigenous or small or minoritized languages. So I put a couple of links here, some great case studies that you could check out if you're interested. But your first question, again, much like a survey, when you start looking at variation, you need to have some idea of what you want to look at already. So if you are working within your own language community, a good place to start is just checking your own intuitions. Have you noticed differences, kind of like the pop soda Coke divide? Have you identified that, like, oh yeah, some people say this, some people say this. Why is that? Similarly, if you don't have a good intuition, you could also ask around, right? A lot of people have very clear observations of these kinds of differences that they have noticed. So if you're just chatting with somebody, do they ever say something like, oh man, yeah, in this town they say this, isn't that weird? And then you can go from there and start looking more deeply into these observations folks have shared with you. So a starting place is to identify the variable, we call it, and this is the specific thing that's different. Identify one or maybe a couple of variables, like what is the word for a sugary fizzy drink? Or, how do you pronounce cow, right, in this town versus this town? So some of the concrete methods, once you have a variable in mind that you might use, are you might ask people to describe a silent movie or a picture book. There are lots of picture books out there that don't have any words. So you can just ask people to tell the story that they are seeing in the picture book. And this has the big advantage of not prompting anyone, right? Not encouraging them to say a certain word or pronounce it a certain way because they see it written that way. So if you want to get at what is ambiguously called natural speech, right? The way someone might say something if they were really comfortable and feeling informal. A silent movie or a picture book is a good tool for this. And I'll give an example of this kind of thing in a second. You can also ask people to read a word list or maybe translate a word list if multilingualism is really common in your community, so that you can get a specific word and see if people pronounce it in different ways. One advantage of having people translate a word list is, again, you might avoid prompting them to say a certain word or pronounce it a certain way. So if you're like, okay, here's an English word list, could you please say this in, I don't know, Dene, right? Then they won't be seeing a specific Dene word written down. They'll just be translating it, and they might be more likely to use whatever word or pronunciation they naturally do in their everyday life. And finally, interviews and conversations are a really great tool for looking at variation, right? If you can get somebody to agree to, I don't know, just take a little microphone to a casual chat with their sister and record 5 minutes of them talking to each other, and have several people do this and listen to how people are pronouncing or saying things in those casual conversations, right? That can also be a really good tool for getting this sort of informal, unself-conscious speech recording. So one example of a variation study like this is something I did in 2015. I visited a village called Bangulap in the west region of Cameroon, and I talked with 33 people who speak Majumba. And they were all living in the same village, but they were all different ages and genders, right? So I made sure to talk to old people and young people and middle-aged people and men and women. And I had this little set of pictures, and these are called the Bowerman-Peterson Topological Relations Picture Series. It's a standard linguistics tool that is meant to get at how people describe objects in relationship to each other, right? You'll notice there's a dog sitting outside a doghouse and the arrow is pointing to the dog. And so I would say something like, where is the dog? And in theory, somebody will respond with the equivalent of the dog is next to the doghouse or the dog is outside the doghouse. Long story short, that's the study I was hoping to do. I wanted to see how people described relationship words in space, right? Outside, under, next to, on top of, whatever. That didn't work out. That's a long story. I couldn't use the recordings for that purpose. But, and this is a good example of how in your language work, things won't go the way you think they will, but you can probably still get something interesting or useful out of it. Instead of looking at words like on top of or next to or under, I noticed something interesting. People were pronouncing certain words differently from each other, right? So when I was learning Majumba, I was told that head was chu, just chu with the ch sound, right? That's how I was taught it. But not everyone said it that way. Different people were using different pronunciations for head. So when I asked, like in French, where is the hat? And people would answer in Majumba, some people would say it's on the head or on the guy's head, and they would say tu with just a plain T. Some people would say tu with like an H, a th with an aspiration on it. Some people would say tu with a ts, and some people would say chu, like I learned, like a ch. And there were 4 different ways people were pronouncing this word for head. And I was like, that's really interesting. What's going on here? So, I did some spreadsheet linguisty stuff where I noted down the age and the gender and where the person had grown up and, what sentence they were saying this word in and all this other stuff. But I noticed an interesting pattern. So this plain T, tu, was mostly said by older men. This was kind of the grandpa pronunciation. And then this T with an aspiration, the tu, was mostly said by older people, both men and women, but slightly more older women. And then su with the ts was mostly said by younger men. So this was like the young dude pronunciation. And then chu with the ch sound was sort of the most widely used, but especially among younger people and especially among younger women, right? And of course, like the pop and coke map, there were a lot of exceptions. It wasn't like a clear pattern, all young men say this and all old women say this, but it was definitely a pattern. And so what we found, instead of learning about words like on or next to or under, we learned something about differences in how different ages and genders of people pronounce this thing, which is really cool. If you'd like to read more about it, I linked a presentation on this study in the slides. And so that's one option, is just have people describe pictures and see if they use different words or different pronunciations, and then start unraveling why or who says a certain thing. And another way, instead of looking at age or gender or any of these other sort of very basic sociolinguistic characteristics, you can also look at regional variety, right? So that study I just talked about was in one village. Pretty clear geographic boundary. If I were to make a map of how Majumba speakers pronounce that across all of the West region, I could make a pretty darn cool map. So you can do these kind of regional variation maps in a lot of languages. There are some really cool ones out there. I think there's a Cree dialect map, and there's another one I'm about to show you. You can ask people from different regions or towns to read a word list or to describe pictures. You can also ask people outright what folks in different areas say differently. And as you're doing this, if you're asking people to pronounce words or describe pictures, Make sure also to ask them a little bit about their language background and their biography if they're comfortable with that, right? Because just because someone is living in a specific town now, maybe they grew up 100 kilometers away. Maybe they lived in 20 different towns when they were growing up, and that shapes the way that they talk. So it's not always as clear as this person is from here and says it this way, and that's this town's pronunciation, but you can start unraveling some cool stuff if you ask also about biographies. So this is one example of a pretty neat atlas. This is the Linguistic Atlas and Survey of Irish Dialects, and this was published back in the 1950s and 60s, and it means to show how different people pronounce different words all across Ireland in the Irish language. So I don't speak Irish, so I'm not going to try and pronounce this correctly, but this is a map of all of the pronunciations across the whole of Ireland of how people said, I sold, right? And this is actually currently getting a modern update by one of our interns here at ELP, Joe Simpson. He's digitizing this atlas and updating it for 2023, right? Because it's been 60 years. People probably talk differently now. And he's including audio files so that you can actually listen to how people pronounce things differently in all of these different places across Ireland. So if you have a lot of time and a lot of resources, you could make a similar map for your language. So just a reminder, analyzing these patterns of variation is a really complicated and big topic. Again, you could spend years studying it. So reach out if you'd like to learn more about analyzing these patterns of variation. And I'd also like to give a shout out to my PhD supervisor, Dr. Katie Drager, who recently released a really clear book on how to do this kind of variationist work in pretty plain language with concrete examples of how to do this analysis. So reach out to me if you want to learn more about that. Then we get into documenting language attitudes and ideologies. And this is one of the most complicated things that it always feels like it's going to slip through your fingers like sand. You're never going to get one clear final answer that is totally correct, but that's good. That's just part of the complicated awesomeness of how humans use language. And so the best you're ever going to do is starting to really identify and unpack and look at some of these patterns of attitudes and ideologies. So some of the ways you might go about this, again, first, observation. Just look around you, listen to what people are saying casually, formally, when politicians make speeches, when people are chatting in the neighborhood store, and see if there is overt behavior that gets at language attitudes, right? Do you ever see someone being scolded for speaking a certain language or pronouncing things a certain way? Do you see signs that say things like don't speak pidgin on campus, right? Do you see these really overt indications of people's feelings and beliefs? Another really fruitful avenue is, I know people say don't read the comments because it's often so hateful and rude and negative, but you can often find some really interesting clues to widespread language beliefs in comment sections on social media posts or podcasts or whatever. You also find things written in the newspaper or said on the news about language, like, oh, I can't believe we don't use this language in schools. It's the most important feature of our community. Or, you know, you see editorials a lot like the English language is in decline because the millennials are on TikTok, stuff like that. So get out there and see what people are saying and writing about language. And you can also look inward, right? Reflect on your own beliefs about language. Are there times when you feel embarrassed to speak a certain way? And why is that? Are there times that you have ever deliberately tried to change the way you talk? And what were you trying to sound like? And how did you change your speech to serve that goal, right? Maybe even write down a list of the things you believe and the actions you've taken around language because of your beliefs and feelings. I see tons of comments in the chat. I will get to those as soon as we're almost through. And so how do we actually start doing quote unquote research on language attitudes and ideologies? Well, interviews are a really good way to get started in this work. And so this is just when you sit down with people and talk to them about their behaviors and their beliefs and their feelings. So one of the goals in designing good interview questions is, there's no such thing as totally objective research. You're always bringing your own personality and beliefs to it, but you might want to try not to steer people into giving you specific answers if you want to understand what they really think and feel. So don't ask, like, is French the most beautiful language? You might ask instead, what languages do you like to hear spoken and why? Right? And you will get really interesting answers to a question like, what language do you like to hear? You could also ask questions like, what languages should people use in the market? Or if you could choose one language out of all the world's languages for your kids to speak, what would it be and why? And in my experience, at least, people love talking about their own opinions. They will gladly tell you all of their thoughts and opinions about language. It's often a very uh, exciting and contentious topic for people to talk about. So you'll rarely have people who don't want to talk about their language opinions. Yeah, so again, my dissertation research was on this type of sociolinguistic documentation, and there is an example interview template for sort of language attitudes and language use. I put a link to my dissertation there. If you scroll all the way to the end, you can find sort of an example interview template for these kinds of questions. But at the end of the day, I just want to reiterate that sociolinguistic documentation, like most kind of language work, is about relationships. Sociolinguistic documentation is about looking at relationships between people, groups of people, between languages, between dialects, between varieties and places and histories and all this complicated stuff that forms our social world. And that means, like in any other social setting, relationships are really important. So your relationships with the community, with the people you work with the languages you're looking at, those are going to be really important in this work. So I encourage all of you to spend extra time building and solidifying those relationships. Maybe if you're on a really tight research deadline and you have to write a paper by 2 months from now and you're stressed about that, you might feel like you don't have time to just sit and hang out at the downtown bar or the bus station or the store or whatever. But trust me, that is part of the research. I spent so much of my dissertation research time just hanging out with people. I felt like I wasn't doing anything, but I was listening and I was observing and I was learning from what people told me. So take that time. It will be worth it. Just talk to folks, sit somewhere in public, observe. And so as we finish up, I want to talk about some of the applications of sociolinguistic documentation. Sorry. So what could we do with this kind of knowledge? Well, in many contexts, it's a really big need to know what languages people use in a specific place so that you can get them necessary information, whether that is emergency preparedness or, for example, COVID information in 2020. ELP did a big initiative collecting COVID information in a lot of languages so people could know how to stay safe. And knowing what languages are present in a specific place lets you know what languages to put out the radio bulletins or the posters or whatever. Especially in language revitalization efforts, having a good understanding of people's beliefs and feelings and attitudes and use patterns around language is really important, right? If you don't understand what people believe about language, it's going to be hard to design an intervention to revitalize one of the languages they use. You might also, especially in revitalization contexts, might want to create awareness or acceptance of variation, right? You might want to avoid situations in which a class of language learners get into a big fight because the teacher taught them one pronunciation, but their grandma said it another way, and now everyone's mad because someone's wrong. Instead, through sociolinguistic documentation, you might be able to show that no, there are different ways to say this, and that's okay. Different people say it in this way and this way and this way. So let's make space in our language classroom for all of these different ways to say it. And similarly, Having good sociolinguistic documentation can help you make better learning and reference materials, right? Let's say you're making a dictionary of your language. You might really want to take the time to include all of the different varieties or pronunciations of a word. If I made an English dictionary and I only listed soda as a word for that fizzy drink, I'd be missing a lot of people who speak English. They might read that dictionary and be like, that's not the word, it's pop. So you might want to have a more comprehensive grammar or dictionary through these kinds of efforts. So now let's have questions. I see so many chat questions. I'm going to check in on those. And if you have any that you'd like to ask live, feel free to raise your hand. So let's see. I see some other words for Coke or pop, including gassy. I have never heard of that. That's great. Tonic, yep. I see a comment that examples where language reflects differences in social class and gender are part of sociolinguistic documentation. Absolutely. And let's see, an example of women who have a different jargon or way of speaking in remote areas. Yes, so bearing this in mind opens vast threads for research. Yes, exactly. So if you had no idea that women had their own way of speaking in specific areas, and you just went and recorded the men, you would be missing half of the way people use that language, and you'd really have a very poor documentation project there. I see a comment here that neighboring dialects of the same language family have variation of pronunciation, right? Exactly. And yeah, I see people do not like the "don't speak pidgin" on campus sign. Me neither. I took photos of all of them while frowning significantly. Yeah. I see similarly a sign, forbidden to speak or to spit and speak Breton. Oh, that's awful. Terrible combination of things. Yeah. That is so common to have these very strong colonial language ideologies in formal school settings. So if you want to look at language ideologies, I suggest checking out your local school. You might find some very strong language ideologies in action there. Let's see, I see a question. What is the name of the paper you referred to in describing appropriation of indigenous languages? Oh my gosh, what was the title of it? It was by Sarah Schulist and some of her colleagues. I will put it in the shared Google Drive folder so y'all can read that. I see a comment. We had a non-native learner degrade and embarrass native non-speakers. Yes, that is uncalled for. If you ever see people putting down folks for the way they talk, this kind of sociolinguistic documentation can give you a lot to work with in shutting down that kind of shaming and degradation. Let's see, a comment from an interpreter. So when people speak Armenian, which I should interpret into English, they speak very differently. And officially, they speak a language I've dubbed ministerial. Yes, that's very common, that when people feel that they're in a very formal setting, they will radically change how they talk, right? All of us do this. We all speak a little bit differently, whether we're, just hanging out with our friends or giving a presentation in a class. We will talk differently. And sometimes it can be really different. It can be night and day, the way people talk when they're trying to perform certain social roles. Let's see. There is still a large contingent of Americans that advocate English only. Yeah, it's pretty bad. And I see a great comment that jokes and satires are the best place to see this. Yeah, to see variation in language attitudes, to see what words and accents are made fun of. Yeah, this is a really great suggestion. You could ask people if they know any jokes about how people talk or about how different people pronounce things. Sometimes this can be in good fun, it can be good natured, sometimes it can be really mean. So prepare yourself for perhaps a little bit of meanness, but sometimes it is just, fun ribbing. I see a comment. One sad thing is there's situations where people are forced to develop negative attitudes about their own language or accent or way of speaking just to be accepted by others or belong to some superior group or class. Yes, this is extremely true. This is especially in colonial or post-colonial settings, you will often see leftover language attitudes from colonial times that tell people that their own languages are inferior or not good enough or whatever, and that people have to speak French or Spanish or whatever dominant colonial language was in play there. You even see this in non-colonial settings where there's some language with more power or prestige, and people internalize that and start feeling bad about their own languages. It is sad. Let's see. I see a question about the distinctions between regional variations versus dialects versus sociolects versus ecolects versus idiolects. Yeah, so these are sociolinguistic terms that sort of reflect different divisions between people, right? So the example for regional variation given here is British English versus American English, right? For variation based on where you physically are in the world. Dialect is often variation within a smaller geographic boundary, right? So how different Americans might talk. Sociolects are a bit more abstract. These are often defined as language differences based around some other form of social identity, right? So whether that is, I don't know, younger versus older people, or people who root for this football team versus this football team, or it might even be a religious difference, right? People who are this religion versus this religion. I've also seen people propose religiolects as differences between religious groups and how they talk. I'm not actually familiar with this term ecolect. I'd love to hear some more about that proposed classification. And then idiolects, it doesn't mean you're an idiot. Idiolects are really sort of the specific, unique way that one person talks. So even if I might call my own English, yeah, I don't know, university US East Coast English, I also have peculiarities that distinguish me from other people who speak university East Coast English. And that would be called like Anna Ballou English, right? Everyone has their own specific way of speaking, and that's your idiolect. Are there any changes to modern classification of the language strata that I may be aware of? Yeah, there has been quite a lot of sociolinguistic research that goes deeper than this, right? A lot of these are what we call first wave sociolinguistic principles. So especially this question of region and age and gender. And then we went a little bit deeper. I'll send a great paper by Penelope Eckert that unpacks these waves in sociolinguistics and how people think about variation. I don't want to get too deep in the weeds because we are getting into sociolinguistic theory. I see a great comment that variation can reflect speakers' relation to you. Yes, for sure. In a lot of languages, there are clear ways that this is marked, right? You might have to use a different pronoun for you if you're talking to someone older than you or younger than you or of greater social rank or whatever. And let's see a long conversation about this concept. Yeah, that in many languages, you change how you talk based on who you are talking to. I see an interesting comment. An uncle told me that if you don't speak 3 languages, English, Swahili, and a local language, you're half a Kenyan. Yeah, that's a really interesting overt language ideology, right? This question of who is a real Kenyan and what does it take? I see a clarification on ecolect. So ecolect is the language you speak with different groups, say your family, one group of friends, and another group of friends, something in between a sociolect and an idiolect. Okay, interesting. I don't think I'd actually seen this term in the literature, but it sounds like it's the way you speak with a given community of practice. I see a comment on diglossia. Diglossia is a sociolinguistic phenomenon where the linguistic market is divided into 2 poles, prestigious versus less prestigious, or high versus low. And this is often expanded to dialects versus languages. Right. And so this can have a really significant effect on language endangerment and language vitality when people choose to move towards the quote unquote high language, the prestige language. Diglossia is a very useful concept in a lot of contexts, but there are also, and again, this is a whole nother talk that I would love to talk to y'all about, but we don't have time. In a lot of contexts, we see what some scholars call small-scale egalitarian multilingualism, where there really isn't a high language or a low language on the prestige scale. There are just a bunch of languages that serve various identity functions or social functions without this prestige differential. You see this in a part of Cameroon called Lower Fungom. There's some wonderful research about how multilingualism works there. So diglossia or polyglossia in the case of more than two languages is really useful to think about prestige differences, but beautifully, it doesn't apply in every context. Isn't that great? Isn't it wonderful, the diversity of ways people use language? I see some comments. How do you make space for variance in pronunciation in dormant languages when you're making learning materials? That is such a great question. So for anybody who's not familiar with this term dormant, a dormant language is a language that currently doesn't have anybody who speaks it fluently or who grew up speaking it. No one alive grew up speaking the language anymore. So all the speakers or fluent speakers have passed on. And so if you're reviving a language that's dormant, if you're getting people to speak it again based on documentation, remember, yay, this is a great purpose of documentation. If a language ever becomes dormant, there is the possibility to revive it from documentation. How do we make space for the ways people might pronounce things differently from those materials if you don't have fluent speakers to consult with? So this is a really good question, and I don't think there's any one best answer. If there is any documentation that variation existed when there were living fluent or proficient speakers, definitely teach people that. Yeah, so it looks like in this case, we have regional differences between O and U. Yep, that's very common. I think the important thing is just to let people know that variation could exist, that in the past there was variation like this. And so let's say somebody's family comes from the O region, somebody else in the class's family comes from the U region. It's okay if they pronounce that differently. Just creating that awareness of variation as a thing that is okay, that is valid, that isn't going to ruin anything, can go a long way in a classroom setting. I see one recommendation. Something I'd recommend is to include different variants in the learning material, especially audio. Yeah, definitely. If you have, let's say, whoever's teaching your language revival effort, even if it's that person trying to pronounce the O variant and the U variant for your audio dictionary, that can be helpful. I see some more comments. The word post-vernacular can be used to describe other dormant languages. Interesting. I don't think I've come across this term post-vernacular, but I like it. See, a really interesting question. Isn't writing what gives prestige to a language since there are languages without writing? What a great question. So this is often the case in many parts of the world and many communities. There is this strong prestige that goes along with writing. People might even consider, right, this is a common language ideology, people might consider a written language to be more real or more official or more valid or more prestigious than a language that isn't written down. And is this legitimate? Well, I mean, it's legitimate in the sense that people truly believe it. But does it have to be this way? No, for sure, no way. There's nothing inherent to writing that makes a language more useful or more prestigious or more valid or whatever. It's often just a product of historical circumstances, right? Some languages might have been deemed by a government or a colonial power to be worth writing down, right? They may have been assigned prestige or power by some authority. Some people may have decided they don't want to write their language down for various reasons, and that's why it's not written. Or maybe just like nobody has decided to do it yet. There's nothing inherent to writing that should give a language prestige, but in many contexts, that is what people believe. And language ideologies are just as real as anything because it determines how people act. So we can unpack writing and prestige and legitimacy a little bit more, but yeah, it's always complicated. Here's a great question. How do you recommend getting over imposter syndrome being a second language learner? This is such a powerful question. Yeah, I think almost everyone I've ever spoken to who is reclaiming a language or revitalizing a language has experienced this kind of imposter syndrome at some point. This notion of I'm not good enough, I'm not learning fast enough, I'm never going to speak perfectly, I don't speak the real language, I'm never going to be a fluent speaker. This is so common, and I'm so sorry that you're experiencing that because it's really tough, especially when you're also navigating historical trauma and probably painful histories that caused the language to be endangered or to need revitalization. One thing I would recommend is talking to other people who are in the same process as you, other people who have struggled with and maybe found ways to overcome this imposter syndrome. And also listen to language leaders who will reassure you that mistakes, that struggle, that difficulty in learning has to be part of your learning process. There is nobody on this earth who goes from not speaking at all to speaking whatever perfectly means to you in a very short period of time. That person does not exist. Everyone struggles and experiences setbacks and stumbles and thinks, I'm never going to learn it. And I think just having the solidarity and encouragement of other learners, whether in your own community or even from other Indigenous communities, can really help. There are a few Instagram accounts that talk about this a lot. And I would also recommend scheduling a meeting with one of our revitalization mentors, Alexandra, who didn't grow up speaking Irish, right? Her parents did not teach her Irish as a little baby, but she started learning when she was a kid or a teenager and has really worked her entire life to be a really strong Irish speaker. But she also deals with this sort of, oh, you're not a real speaker because you're from the city and that's not good enough and you'll never be a native speaker. And she's really good at talking with people about this struggle of language reclaimers, of language learners. So I will drop a link to make an appointment to talk with her for anyone that is struggling with this kind of imposter syndrome and feeling like you'll never be a good enough speaker. You'll get there, I promise. There's a wonderful quote from a linguist called Annika Pasanen, who works with Sami languages. And she said in one of her talks, only a language that is allowed to be used imperfectly can be revitalized. And that's true. If people aren't allowed to make mistakes as they're learning, they'll never learn. Everybody makes mistakes. Don't beat yourself up about it. Just keep trying. And I see some more questions. Yeah, one comment, a language belongs to the persons that speak it. Yeah, that's a good way to remember that it's okay that you're not speaking however you want to be speaking yet. It's still your language because you are using it. So just keep using it. And all right, I think that's all the questions, and the rest is just sort of discussion of specific language questions and specific contexts. But yeah, I do see some discussion of this shaming of especially young people who don't speak well enough for elders or for fluent speakers or whatever. And yeah, this is common all around the world. But I just want to share one example from my own research. And this is a good reminder, maybe for those of you who are struggling with elder shaming. In my research, a lot of older IASA speakers would complain to me that kids said these few words wrong, that kids obviously didn't speak IASA because they said this one stupid word wrong. And, you know, a lot of elders were very judgmental or displeased by this. And so I wanted to look at the thing they were talking about, the example is basically like people would put extra plurals on stuff. So in English, it was the equivalent of saying like forkses, right? The right way to say it is forks, but the kids are saying forkses, and it made the elders kind of annoyed. And so I wanted to know if people actually said forkses, if young people said that, and I wanted to know if that meant that they didn't speak Iasa well. I wanted to know if that actually correlated to lower proficiency in Iasa. And so I spent a long time having people like describe a little movie where people use forks. And I noticed not that many people said forkses, but also old people said it too. Even older people, some of them used this new plural form, which, some people might judge as being wrong, but even some elders who had spent their whole life speaking Iasa said that. And so sometimes that kind of judgment is more in attitude than in reality. So just keep that in mind. If somebody is shaming a specific pronunciation or the way somebody talks, it doesn't always mean you're actually a bad speaker. It could just be that person being a little grumpy or having an attitude about the people who say it that way or whatever. And I see one more comment. It circles back to the webinar about description versus prescriptive. Yeah, exactly. Some people have strong feelings about how a language should be spoken, but that doesn't mean it's not okay to speak in some other way. Yeah. Don't let the prescriptivists ruin your fun, says this comment. Bravo. Yeah. Don't let them ruin your fun. Let's see. Any other questions? I see that we're a bit over time, so sorry about that. Let's see. I see one more question in chat. Time is a factor. Yes. So there was a certain stretcher for moose hides that had a specific name and carrier, but now no one can remember the name. Yeah, this is a really good example of how sometimes specific vocabulary can be forgotten sooner than a language itself. So if you notice, maybe there's a kind of vocabulary for an activity not many people do anymore, you might want to prioritize documenting that just in case people are not transmitting the knowledge of that specific kind of vocabulary anymore. It might be really useful to future learners to have a record of that. See a comment about hypercorrection. Yeah, this is an interesting sociolinguistic concept where essentially, let's say you want to sound fancy, right? Like you want to use the prestige variant and you notice like, okay, you notice a pattern that's different between the prestige variant and maybe your normal variant. Hypercorrection is when you kind of overshoot the mark and you go even beyond the prestige variant and say something that might be considered incorrect in the prestige variety, but is sort of your brain extrapolating the pattern for how to sound fancy and taking it too far. I wish I could come up with a good example right now. There are tons of classic sociolinguistic examples of hypercorrection, so I'll try and remember to put some in the Google folder as well, because it's really interesting once you start noticing hypercorrections. All right. Oh yeah, the misuse of shall. Yes, people think shall sounds very fancy, so they'll use it in places where shall doesn't really belong because they're trying to sound fancy. All right, I think I don't see any more questions in chat. If anyone has some they'd like to ask live, feel free to just raise your hand or speak up. But if you think of any questions that you forgot to ask during the session, you can always email me, and we will see you next week for a really great technical skills session on how to use this software called Elan, which, as a side note, will be very useful for noting how people pronounce things if you're looking at variation. So see you next week. I hope you all keep well, and we look forward to seeing you again soon. Take care, everybody.